start recording and I'm going to let everyone in. Welcome, everyone. Give you guys a couple seconds. Welcome, welcome to the Connected Brewer Real-Time Fermentation Monitoring, sponsored by Magline. Thank you. It's a presenting partner today. We also have some fabulous session sponsors today I want to highlight. I would like to thank Ironheart Canning, also Precision Fermentation, who is with us today. So thank you. And Drink Tanks. I'll be putting their links and resources in chat. Please take a second to check that out. I'd also like to ask you guys, if you haven't already, please sign our attendee sheet. We're trying to keep track of everybody. So I'm going to put that link right now in chat. Also, if you wouldn't mind keeping yourselves on mute as we go throughout this session, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in chat and we'll be calling on people periodically if they have questions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dave Frizzell from Precision Fermentation and Andrew Turner from Vicino Brewing. Thank you guys so much for participating in the New York State Craft Brewers Conference.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the New York Craft Brewers Association for having us. As you mentioned, this is the Connected Brewer, leveraging real-time monitoring to elevate product quality and operational efficiency. And to keep this kind of snappy, we're just going to dive in. So my name is Dave Frizzell, as you mentioned. I'm a senior product development specialist with Precision Fermentation. I've been with the company for just over 2 years, helping to develop the Brew Monitor system as a whole and really figuring out the science behind all of this. And then we have Andrew Turner, who is the head brewer at Vicino Brewing Company, right down the street here in Carborough, North Carolina. Andrew has helped us out tremendously, as he is our microbiological guru. He has been in the industry for, let's say, about as long as I've been alive. Not to put a date on it, Andrew, sorry. And I'll be honest, I drink too much of his beer because it's so close to where I live. So Andrew's going to be chiming in as I go along and make this presentation to try and prevent PowerPoint. It's very important that that we don't keep everyone too long. So to get into it, what we're going to talk about today, some of the issues with traditional fermentation management styles, and we'll talk some details there. We'll discuss real-time fermentation monitoring and what that means to a brewery in general. We'll also discuss what a brewer needs, what actually helps make a good beer, and what things should you be monitoring in real time. Finally, comparing all of that data to everyone wants to taste their own beer, and a couple side benefits, a couple bonuses to businesses, and a few that have saved me here in our test brewery. So traditional fermentation monitoring. Previously, in the history of human brewing, fermentation monitoring was sort of add ingredients and, I don't know, pray, hope that it came out good, drinkable, wouldn't kill you, that kind of thing. And then a few hundred years ago, we got, with the advent of a greater scientific method, we got some manual instruments, pH meters. We developed the idea of using density as an analog for sugar, and these are great. This really gives us a greater look into what's happening inside a fermenter. However, the downside of that is it's a snapshot view. It is a single data point in time. While that is very helpful, a snapshot is not as useful as a full video, right? Getting the progress of your entire fermentation start to finish. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit further. So I really enjoy this slide. I put this in there, and I know Andrew does as well. This is yeah, go on.
I was really pleased to see this slide because this is one that I've talked to a lot of people about, and I recommend this paper if you want to understand what you're doing to your yeast during fermentation. All of the stresses and strains that you put them through, this can affect future performance. and in the chat to the paper if people want to download it.
Yep, absolutely. The important part that Andrew touched on there is these are yeast stressors. This is not a graph of anything having to do with the beer itself, but merely all of the things that we do to yeast over the course of, let's say, one generation, from propagation through a fermentation and then into yeast storage before the next fermentation kicks off. There's a lot of things happening in there that we don't necessarily have a very good handle on. Most of that is because we have a very complex process starting with organic raw materials, which can be variable in themselves. We have the entire metabolism of an organism to deal with, and you put that all inside of an industrial setting, and you really don't have eyes on it, right? You can't do benchtop measurements in an industrial setting with any sort of efficiency. And so all of that leads to, just to put it bluntly, a lack of control. Some of these readings could be inefficient or inaccurate when taken by, let's say, different people over the course of a fermentation. And that is no one's fault in particular, merely differences in measurement style. Maybe one cellarman accounts for parallax slightly different than another when taking a manual gravity reading. There's also the effect of popular wisdom. A lot of folks rely on a single source for their brewing data. While that can be very useful, it also has a few drawbacks. And then finally, with the rise of COVID-19, we're seeing fewer people being able to be in a brewery at one time. That means fewer hands on deck to be able to take these measurements. And that can lead to perhaps not taking all of the data you need to over the course of a fermentation. And I'll pause there to see if any questions popped up.
No questions in chat. Anybody have questions? Go ahead and unmute yourselves. All right, I think we're good.
Perfect.
To get going.
Pretty straightforward stuff so far. I love to hear that. So this is the solution we came up with: real-time fermentation monitoring, meaning gathering high volume, high quality data in an automated way and then presenting it in a way that you can actually gain knowledge from it, which we'll get into. That will allow you better insight into what your yeast are doing, and including control over your products over time, meaning from batch to batch, more consistency in your brands. This is what we have here. On the right side of your screen, the far right side, we got that black box there. It's about the size of a shoebox, roughly, weighs about 13 pounds. That is our Brew Monitor, our sensor hub. It attaches directly to your tank, and it contains all of the equipment necessary to take automated measurements and send them directly to what you see on the left side there is our Brew Monitor console. It's a web app, can be accessed from any web-enabled device, iPad, phone, computer, tablet, anything like that. And it allows you to visualize your data, not just in a chart form, but also in graphs. And further to that, there's some analytical functions built into the console to allow you to gain knowledge from all of this data. So I keep saying data. What do we need? Pretty basic stuff. Gravity, obviously. pH, very important for yeast health. Dissolved oxygen, that's sort of what I like to push on people. Dissolved oxygen is one of the most important metrics that you can measure when it comes to a fermentation, and that many breweries don't measure, or maybe don't measure accurately. Finally, temperature. We all know temperature is critical for flavor production. And then pressure and conductivity, we'll get into a bit more later, but essentially those will be process controls, being able to make sure that the beer is brewed exactly the same way each time. So our CEO likes to use a lot of little phrases, and data to decision is one of those that has always stuck in my head. I really enjoy it because it describes what we do very well. We take data, like I said, high frequency, high quality data, and we present it in such a way that allows a brewer to make an informed decision. So this high quality, high frequency data may indicate some type of issue with perhaps your yeast vitality, whether that be a slightly slower fermentation than you're used to, or some off flavors produced in your beer. Those will allow, giving this data to you will allow the brewer to intervene earlier than previously expected. So rather than seeing 2 gravity points very, very close together over the course of 2 days, what if you were to, able to see that gravity slow down over the course of 2 hours? That would give you an additional 46 hours to make a decision and intervene as early as possible. Intervention allows you to correct the trajectory of your fermentation and potentially save a batch. And so in order to gain that knowledge, I want to talk about graphing a little bit. In my opinion, high volume data is useful, but only as useful as the graphs that you can make out of it. I really enjoy making graphs. And so let's say, for instance, you had a brewer with lots of time on his hands. I know Andrew's has had a lot of time recently. He hasn't been ramping up in production. So let's say, for instance, Andrew has a lot of time and he chooses to take 2 samples a day on 5 parameters: gravity, pH, temperature, pressure, and conductivity, for instance. He would gather, over the course of a 14-day fermentation, 140 data points. With real-time fermentation monitoring, you would have nobody needing to take these measurements. You would get roughly 1,000 times that amount of data. Excuse me, 100 times that amount of data. My math's a little off. That much data, again, is useful, but only as useful as the amount of knowledge you can gain from it. And so now we get into graphing. Actually, before we get into graphing, let me just pause, make sure we don't have any questions come through.
So far, we're good.
Beautiful. So gravity, everybody understands what this does for a brewer, what you can do with gravity measurements. But real-time fermentation monitoring will give you graphs like this that you see on your screen there. This is a beer that I brewed in-house, starting roughly 12 degrees Plato, finishes at about 3.5. I believe this is my English pale. The beautiful things about gravity is if you take it once or maybe twice a day, you'll get a reasonable estimate of how your fermentation looks, but you will not be able to get graphs of this resolution. You might be able to predict the slope of your fermentation, the amount of fermentation activity occurring at one time, but this graph will just give it to you right off the bat. And so having this amount of granularity in your gravity measurement will allow you to detect fermentation activity, or rather the end of fermentation activity, as soon as it's done. So let's say, for instance, a brewer takes a gravity measurement on Saturday the 11th. Sunday the 12th, it's still dropping very slowly. Monday the 13th, it has dropped slightly more. And then they take another measurement on Tuesday, and it hasn't really moved much. And then they take another measurement on Wednesday, and it hasn't moved much. And now that brewer is sure that that fermentation has completed. That's 2 days after the fermentation has actually completed. What would you be able to do if you were given 2 days back? Start your VDK rest 2 days earlier. Start crashing the tank 2 days earlier. Transfer it to a bright 2 days earlier. This would be on every tank in your brewery at all times. What would your brewery be able to do with an additional 2 days per tank per fermentation? You'd be able to turn your brew house 12 times more a year. How many more batches of beer would that account for in your yearly revenue? I think that's very important to pay attention to. And then on the flip side of that, knowing a fermentation has been stuck or stalled as soon as it occurs, rather than taking a gravity measurement one day and then the next day. Now you're a full 24 hours into a stalled fermentation. Being able to rectify that as early as possible could potentially save a batch. Dissolved oxygen. This is my wheelhouse. I absolutely love discussing this. We have worked with several breweries who have used the Brew Monitor to monitor fermentation, and right at knockout, turn the Brew Monitor on and see what their actual dissolved oxygen level is in tank, rather than measuring at their knockout line, at their heat exchanger, which could give you a very slightly skewed result because you have so much oxygen present in there at once. Some of it will dissolve, some of it will come out of solution and bubble up through your fermenter. It is a very important metric to take for yeast health, and some brewers are taking it not quite as accurately as maybe they would like. So your precise dosing of dissolved oxygen at knockout is key for optimal performance. Too little DO and your yeast isn't maybe as vital as it could be. Too much DO and you may risk some oxidation. You may risk some oxidative stress on your yeast. Second thing that, go on, Andrew.
No, the other part is to show up, and this will be a theme, is that it can show up potential variation in your oxygenation that you didn't know was there. That, you know, from batch to batch, you think you're putting a certain amount in, but it's varying. And by having in the tank, before you even pitch your yeast, you have a chance to fix that. Before, if you've got too much oxygen, maybe you can blow it off a little bit or something. Or if you haven't had enough, you can dose a little bit more and get it to the level you need. And that way you can keep your yeast viability and not stressing them by not having oxygen. And so you get a couple more turns out of that yeast. So those things, there's a number of parameters here, your density and such like that. You can see the fermentation's even started, whether you're hitting the points that you should be hitting, and maybe having time to actually fix them before you do pitch your yeast.
Absolutely. You brought up a few good points that I want to touch on. The first being variability from knockout to knockout. In one tank of beer, maybe you knock out twice or three times. Having real-time fermentation monitoring on that tank during those knockouts will allow you to say, well, that first knockout, that was actually a little high on DO, so I'm going to knock it back down a little bit for the second one. So then you can really dial it in from not just batch to batch, but within one batch. And the other important thing that I think is going to be a running theme throughout this this presentation that I think I'll need to stress a little bit more in the future is trying to get every little bit out of the equipment you already have. And that includes your yeast. So trying to get every extra generation out of yeast will save you on buying a fresh pitch or having to pay for expedited shipping. I know I'll discuss that here in a little bit as well, but what we're focusing on is taking the brewery you already have and making it run as efficient as possible with minimal input. And Andrew, you also brought up there the dissolved oxygen uptake, right? That metric is going to be critical for understanding when fermentation kicks off and also how healthy those yeast are. So that rate of dissolved oxygen uptake here in this graph, this is actually a double knockout. You can see they knocked out maybe a touch high on dissolved oxygen here, but not too high. 28 ppm is all right. And then this is the second. You can see that dissolved oxygen started to drop as the yeast consumed it. Then they knocked out again, oxygenated there as well. And then we have this steep dissolved oxygen drop off as the yeast consume all that oxygen as rapidly as possible, converting it into new cellular membrane and producing more yeast as they go through their logarithmic growth. That's a very good sign of very healthy, very vital yeast. The other thing there is comparing this alongside a few other metrics, which we'll talk about, really gives a brewer a great indication that activity is underway in your tank, even though you may not see, let's say, bubbles in a blow-off bucket. That is often a point of stress for many people. Did this fermentation kick off? Will I come in tomorrow morning and see no activity? And I know Andrew has lost sleep about this very thing before. So giving that indicator from your phone, sitting at home, watching TV, just being able to pull it up and say, yep, everything looks like it's moving as normal. We're good. I'm not even in the brewery and I can tell. just that little bit of stress relieved from someone that's a huge goal for us. pH, very similar to dissolved oxygen in that this can be a very useful indicator of yeast health. During that log growth phase, and actually before the log growth phase, as the yeast are acclimating to a new media, your fresh pitch of wort, as they start prepping that media for their own growth, we see an immediate drop in pH. This is due to organic acid production as soon as those yeasts hit fresh wort. They're prepping their environment to make sure that no other microbes can take over, right? And that's one thing that we love yeast for, is they're exceptionally competitive. And so seeing that pH drop right at the start during this sort of log growth and into fermentation, that's going to be a very good indicator of your yeast health as well. Two parts of that is we want pH to drop fairly rapidly as the yeast start producing those acids, but not too rapidly. That little bit too rapid pH drop can indicate stressed yeast. So we want that to be somewhere in the between. And one thing that will be very helpful in determining what that ideal drop is going to be just comparing fermentations to each other. Having this pH graph from 5 fermentations and comparing them all and saying, yep, these all look normal. There's one outlier here. This one dropped a little steeper. Maybe that was generation 12 of that yeast strain or that yeast pitch, and maybe it's time to get a new one. The other thing that pH is a great indicator for, as you get this slight rise in pH towards the end, some of those organic acids get reconsumed as a tertiary carbon source, secondary or tertiary carbon source. You get this very gentle rise as the yeast start cleaning up all their byproducts. This total drop in pH from start to finish is going to be important for brand identity, simply because acids are flavor positive, right? We add FOS in order to acidify things or use acidulated malt. These things are all critical for maintaining brand identity. I'll just ask Jen, do we have anything coming through?
No questions from the chat, but I have one for you. I'm just curious.
Sure.
Can the data start to predict yeast health or trends? For instance, if you use your yeast for 5 generations or 6 or whatnot, can you start to see a trend that maybe after 4 generations you should start changing it instead of the 5 or 6 that you were doing before?
That is exactly the goal here.
Oh.
So you absolutely nailed it. And we'll discuss fermentation comparisons towards the end of this presentation. But the short answer is absolutely yes. When you have, let's say, 10 generations of yeast and you have the Brew Monitor on all 10 of them, and then you can compare them, 3, 4 at a time and see that degrading in yeast health. You can see maybe the dissolved oxygen starts to drop slightly slower, or the pH production is a little wonky, or your gravity maybe doesn't move quite as fast. All of those things are going to be very strong indicators that maybe that crop has run its course. Maybe it's time to switch that crop to a different style of beer. Maybe you've been brewing, higher gravity beers with that crop over and over again, and maybe it's time for a slightly less stressful environment for them. And so that is our goal, is to be able to extend that yeast vitality for as long as possible, while again maintaining the flavor of your beer. At no point do we want to compromise that, but getting an extra turn out of that yeast crop while maintaining your beer's quality could save you, I don't know, a few $100s a batch, maybe more.
I've got a couple more questions.
Potentially,
Sorry,
potentially
Andy,
it saves you a batch. Potentially it saves you a batch, because if you have something that's going to stall out, if you looked at the data and realized earlier that it was time to switch that yeast, you could have saved yourself a failed batch. So that can be huge. Right.
Awesome. You also, we had another question come through. What can be done to change the pH drop rate?
That's actually a very good question. At that point, it's going to be, like I said, just managing your yeast. ensuring that if you do store yeast over time, make sure it's stored correctly, not too much pressure. Don't cold crash it too hard. Yeast they are hardy, but they are still they're still pressure sensitive and temperature shock sensitive. So treat your yeast gently. Acid wash can help quite a bit maintaining that crop over time. I use phosphoric for my acid wash. Just get it down to 3 pH or so. Yeast are pretty tolerant of that. And again, just monitor it. Double check and make sure that that pH drop is not too rapid over the course of each fermentation, and then take corrective actions following after that.
Awesome, thank you.
Of course. Andrew, do you have anything else to add on the yeast health aspect?
Not right now. I think we
Perfect.
get into some of that a little later.
Yeah, you're not wrong. All right, cool. Now, this pressure measurement is actually quite interesting to me and has saved me quite a bit of trouble in the past. So first, we're using a relative pressure. So we're using gauge pressure. So this will measure the hydrostatic pressure in your tank only. So the beautiful part of that is, as you can see in this graph, it's very useful for process controls. So this beer here was double knockout. We can see that because there's a slight rise in hydrostatic pressure over time. And then the fermentation continued. This is a fairly rapid fermentation, 5 days start to finish. And then some top pressure was added to condition it. So they probably added a PSI or two, cold crashed it very gently, and then conditioned it for a long period there. We can see other things such as spunding. As you naturally carbonate your beer, that's very useful for potentially saving on CO2. I really enjoy spunding here in the brewery because it saves me on CO2, and I know exactly when to spund because I know exactly when my gravity reaches 1.1 degrees Plato above terminal. I have that consistent gravity measurement coming through, and so that's a very useful way to be able to spund non-lagers or a faster fermenting brand. The other thing that has saved me is an alert system, which I won't get into too deeply, but you can set up alerts with the system. So I had an alert set up for, I believe it was 2 PSI. I got home, I was headed to bed, and I got an alert on my phone. Hey, you didn't open the blow-off valve. Your tank is generating pressure because fermentation's underway, but your blow-off valve's closed. So I had to come back to the brewery at midnight. But it was a lot better than coming into a tripped PRV at 9 a.m. the next day. So little things like that, just again, ease the brewer's mind. You don't want people stressing about their beer. Beer is supposed to be a beautiful thing.
Well, there's another thing there is that you don't want to find out the hard way that your PRV isn't working. And also once you start getting to that pressure, you're in activation yeast health. Pressure and CO2 become toxic to yeast at certain points. So, if you miss that, then you can end up adversely affecting the health of your fermentation. And again, by having that alert set, you can save yourself a batch. And there's also, Dave talked earlier about the stress on the brewer, not just the stress on the yeast. It was something I was doing, critical parameter. And normally to know if things, I'm expecting the pH to drop to a certain point at a certain time. And just having that alert pop up on my phone meant that I got a good night's sleep that night, rather than stressing and worrying and waiting to come in the next morning. And so that can be that's one of the side effects of using a system like this is de-stressing the brewer, is stressing your yeast.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, 15 PSI, some yeast can handle that, but I think I used Nottingham on that batch. They don't tolerate 15 PSI for long periods of time. And Andrew, you brought up a good point. You are one brewer with one assistant brewer, 2 men running an entire operation. You can't have eyes on all the time. And so it is up to just the 2 of you. What if you could just have an eye on it? all the time. That would be very helpful for a lot of people, I think. All right, we're going to cruise right along. Fluid temperature. I didn't put a lot of bullets on this slide because I think it doesn't need too much discussing. We all understand the effects that the temperature of your wort has on your fermentation. You know, flavor production, yeast health, all these things. You really want to maintain that temperature window. One of the really important things about it is, what if something potentially goes wrong? A solenoid gets stuck open, or like I've done, and I stress this because I am not a brewer, I forgot to turn on the glycol jackets before I left. And I got an alert saying, hey, your beer's fermenting at 27C, are you sure? And I was not sure, so I had to come back in the brewery and turn on the glycol jacket. All of these little things that we take for granted, we just assume that our glycol system is going to work properly. Understanding as soon as something goes wrong, that you can fix it is a huge relief. If you could just fix a potentially crashed tank 16 hours earlier than you would normally, that would be a pretty massive save if you can rescue it just one batch of beer, just one tank.
But there's another side to this. Again, it's the not directly related to fermenting, but to your setup. The blower valve is one thing, but this can also be glycol system. Are you seeing time your glycol turns on and off? Are you seeing some fermenters spike more than others? So you have positional effects in your brewery, either to relative ambient temperature or to where it is in the loop on your glycol system. So it can, you know, potentially point to things that could be fixed on your glycol system to make every fermenter ferment efficiently, rather than some fermenting more efficiently than others.
Absolutely true. I had a lengthy talk with one of our engineers about hysteresis when it comes to feedback loops in glycol systems, and how you know, balancing the correct temperature of your glycol with the correct temperature flow rate, and minimizing the hysteresis of, you know, fluid temperature fluctuations. And it was fascinating and a little bit above my head, but this is the kind of thing that we want to help people gain, like I said, gain efficiency with the system you already have in place. Conductivity is a really interesting metric that honestly not many people know too much about. Conductivity, very simply, is the electrical conductivity of a fluid. In this case, we're measuring the level of free ions or dissociated ions in your wort. We've seen two kind of interesting factors with this. The first is brewing salt additions. We can see here right around, we'll call it 1875 microsiemens per centimeter. That's a fairly low conductivity measurement. So perhaps this was more of a Pilsner with much fewer ions, many fewer ions in your wort. But if you were to Burtonize a beer, or you're making a big imperial stout, we would expect to see that number much higher, you know, in the 3000 microsiemen range, maybe even higher than that. So this metric right at the start of fermentation, right at knockout even, can be a very useful metric for ensuring that you got your brewing salt additions correct and maintaining that from batch to batch. I know I mix up calcium chloride and calcium sulfate in my head quite a bit, which are essentially opposites. So, you know, ensuring that you have those really nailed down can be very helpful. And I know Andrew's very excited to talk about acids and conductivity, so I'll let him take over.
So your conductivity is basically driven by two things: the water chemistry that you have, water chemistry modifications that you make, and also the higher the gravity that you're producing, the more buffering capacity, that conductivity that you will have. And so from batch to batch, activities coming out the same, as Dave said, is a measure of consistency in your brewing. The other thing is the higher the conductivity, the higher the buffering capacity of your wort, the longer it will take to see a pH drop, because the yeast production of their acids has to overcome that inherent buffering capacity before you will start to see the pH drop. So from brew to brew, different type of beer, different gravity, different water, you will see differences in how a particular yeast will perform. The yeast may be performing just as well, but the pH drops might be different based on what they're working with. But I think there's a number of parameters we have here that, as I said, before you even put yeast in, you can, your DO, your gravity, your conductivity, your pH, did everything go right?
And what you said there really reinforces the need to compare batch to batch and ensure that you compare these metrics to like metrics, because having this value is very useful, in and of itself, but comparing it to previous batches or future batches or experimental batches, if you're trying something new, will be exceptionally helpful. Alrighty. And wow, what a good segue. It's like I planned it. So developing a baseline. So these are 3 beers I brewed in-house. This is English, whatever. It's an English pale ale. We'll just call it that. So the really interesting thing, and again, I will keep saying it, I'm not a brewer. We can see some differences in starting gravities and some differences in terminal gravities. And very slight differences in the rate of fermentation or this decay of gravity. These are all very indicative of processes that I did, things that I may have changed, or maybe I didn't get perfectly correct from batch to batch. Now, I expect most of you all's fermentations to be very much closer than these. However, differences can still pop up. Differences in, like I said, batches or different brands. If you have an ingredient change, right? We start with these organic raw ingredients that vary from crop to crop. So getting that COA from your malt provider and making sure you're using all the information they provided to you to maintain brand consistency is very helpful. But knowing exactly what you do with those raw ingredients as well is going to be, I think, perhaps a bit more helpful.
There's also an aspect here of the more manual and hands-on your brew house is, and so for those with more automation, then you should see variations. If you start seeing large variations, then that may be an indication you have some upstarts that you need to take a look at. And over time, you will be able to get an idea of what variances come out of your brew house and things you can control and things you can't control. I know my brew house is very hands-on, so my variance is higher than maybe I would like, but still within acceptable range for consistent batches out. But these are things that, again, can point to problems that you didn't know you had.
Thank you for throwing me that lifeline, because I have a very manual 3-barrel system here behind me. That's what it's the systems issue. We also had a brewery that we work with local to us get a new brew house. They switched from I think it was a 10 hectoliter system to a 20-barrel system. And they found this fairly useful to be able to compare old batches brewed on their 10 hectoliter system to new batches brewed on their 20, and have that historical data in order to reference. And really, they found not much difference, which is excellent. Switching an entire brew house and the volume of the brew house to that degree and seeing no huge differences between the batches is indicative of good brewing processes. So developing a baseline is critical. This is the same graphs, the same beers in a slightly different format, but comparing them to each other is going to be important for picking up the little details here, right? This rate of fermentation change, and okay, maybe I mashed in a bit hot with this gray one there. little things like that, like Andrew said, finding the things that you can change or you do have control over, and keeping those as consistent as possible. That's what we're trying to emphasize. This is another brewery that we work with. These are 3 beers they brewed. We can see the pHs are very slightly different. And the reason for that is they started acidifying their wort very slightly more, I should say. And so we have 2 batches that they started here. The black and the green lines were 2 historical batches, and we can see a fairly large difference in starting pH. The slope looks roughly the same, and they end pretty close to the same. And those are the 3 kind of metrics I look for when it comes to pH curves of a fermentation. What they did with that was take some of the information there, establish a baseline, and then make some decisions based on that. Like I said, data to decision. It just goes over and over in my head because my CEO won't stop bringing it up. And here we get to our case study. Interestingly, Full Steam is also the brewery that switched to a new brew house, but this is not a case study based on their brew house. This is actually a really interesting point that was brought up to me by one of our sales engineers. He knows these folks well and started discussing this with them. So what we have here is 2 gravity curves. The gray is, this is a palo, by the way. The gray here is their first batch that they used as a baseline, and the green is something that they changed up. So another thing to pay attention to, this is a double knockout. So this is a first knockout here, and then we can see a second knockout there with that jump. So this first fermentation, they brewed as normal and drank and enjoyed the flavor. So then they said, well, what can we do to change this fermentation rate? How can we speed this up slightly without affecting the flavor of their beer? What they did was increase their pitch rate by between 40 and 50%, which is a pretty massive increase. And what we can see is this first knockout actually got a little bit of fermentation activity already, a second knockout, and then rapid fermentation. And the key things to notice, in my opinion, on these graphs are the terminal gravities of the 2 beers and how long it took to get there. So the terminal gravities, really the beers ended right around the same spot. This one took 180 hours in the gray. This one took maybe just over 100. 80 hours, let's call that 3 days extra to reach terminal. That's a pretty massive time savings for one batch of beer. So let's look slightly further into it. They really used this concept of data to decision. We gave them high volume, high quality data, graphed it, they gained some knowledge from that data. They used that as a baseline, and then made an informed decision based on the knowledge they gained, increasing that pitch rate. Actually, that 50 is slightly lower than 50%. I think it was about 45% increase in pitch rate. And then they saw a significant increase in throughput. So this brew house, or rather these fermenters, can now turn a beer up to 3 days faster than previously. Now, as I mentioned before, subjective analysis has to go hand in hand with objective data. Continue to taste your beer, set up tasting panels. I love doing triangle tastings and getting blind tastings going and comparing one batch to another, especially when you make a change as massive as increasing your pitch rate by that amount. I'll pause very quick. I know that was a lot of information at once. Jen, are there any questions coming through?
Yes, you have a question from Adam. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple questions. One, you talked about conductivity, and if the conductivity isn't right for the style, you'd be adjusting your salts, and that would be possibly for your next batch. Would there be value in adjusting your salts during the fermentation of that specific batch?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. I don't have a good answer to that. I don't necessarily think that the conductivity is the important factor for each batch of beer, but rather using the conductivity as an insurance policy that you added the correct brewing salts in your mash would be more what we're talking about there.
Yeah, okay, my sense is it's good for just the next batch, but to mess and futz with things, just to tweak that little variable is probably not worth the risk.
I think that seems a bit
And
fiddly. Yeah,
I
agree.
think the taste testing that part would be, was there a noticeable difference in the final product, the flavor, the shelf life, and that kind of thing? And if there isn't, what you're building there is that you know you have variance. You know this high is good, and you know this low is good, and you have that window to work it.
Never underestimate a tasting panel, but that's a great way to go. The other question was related, you mentioned a too fast of a pH drop. What rate is considered too fast?
Again, very dependent on yeast strain, and as Andrew mentioned, very dependent on the buffering capacity of your wort. So that's why we reinforce these setting baselines is super critical, because there is no prescription for that. There is no, one pH over the course of a day is too fast. It would be very dependent, not just strain to strain, but brand to brand as well. In my testing here, I really only brew the one beer with some variances, and I use primarily one strain. So I'm seeing in the range of 0.8 to 1.2 pH points over the course of about a day, 24 to 36 hours. That, and like Andrew said, I have that window to work with.
I think another part of that is if that you see a rapid pH drop, but you don't see a rapid DO uptake, and you don't see the kind of gravity drop that you would normally expect, then you can probably assume that that rapid pH drop is down to yeast stress, and that those yeast are not happy, and that you're going to have to look at could you pitch some more yeast in from a different source, or you know that you might not be able to repitch that yeast, that kind of thing.
All right, great, thank you.
Thanks, Adam. I really appreciate it. I like this format. I like being able to see folks when they ask questions. And Andrew actually brought up a good point there as well. Where this company was founded, where we sort of got our start, was on the idea of multi-parametric comparisons or multi-parametric analyses. So just using pH for an indicator of yeast health is not particularly helpful, but using it alongside all of these other metrics and ensuring that you are comparing each one to each other and seeing what information you can glean from that can be much more powerful than any one metric alone. All right, right on. We're getting towards the end. Now we have some sad things to talk about. Stalled fermentations. In fact, I would call this a failure to launch fermentation. So this is a brewery we worked with back in, I believe it was May of last year. They wanted to try something new, and they decided to brew an imperial seltzer. Everyone's getting in on the seltzer game. It's become very big, and they wanted to brew a high gravity seltzer just to see what they could get going with their brand. So as you can see, we are 4 full days into quote unquote fermentation before we get any activity. If one were to pay attention to this very closely over time, you might be able to catch that just a bit earlier, maybe a day or two earlier. But in order to drive home, this gravity curve is very telling, because we can see nothing happens for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of fermentation. But as I mentioned before, that multi-parametric comparison is really where the power is in this. So we'll just overlay the conductivity that we measured on this batch, slap that right on top of gravity, and that really gives you a greater insight into what's happening here. So we reached out to the brewery and discussed what they did. This first bump in conductivity, also worth mentioning, because it's a seltzer, very low buffering capacity, low conductivity, started in the 300 microsiemen range. Remember, I was talking about Burtonized beers can be up in 3,000. So super low conductivity on this fermentation. This first bump, they added yeast nutrient. And that's also reflected in the pH graph, which I do not have here. But some yeast nutrient was added. And we can see that actually did have an effect. Something happened. We got a little bit of fermentation activity, really didn't do too much. And then we have this double steep increase in conductivity. What they did was rehydrated some turbo yeast and chucked that into the tank. And that got them going. They dropped down to, actually, I think this went below 0 Plato, which would make sense. High gravity with 100% fermentable sugars is probably well below 0 degrees Plato in just over 2 days. So the power of this system, or the power of this fermentation monitoring style, is really, if you caught it here and tried something new and then hydrated that turbo yeast and chucked it in, this experimental batch could have been done 4 or 5 days earlier. And we have this as record. We now have this to look back on and say, all right, this is what we did wrong. This is what we did right. Let's correct it for the future. So we're not only discussing brand stability and brand identity, but also experimentation and seeing what new thing you can do with your brew house and follow whatever new trend is coming out, right? And jump on it. This will be very helpful in that. So to wrap up, a couple of the things we've covered. Early detection leads to early intervention. Earlier intervention leads to not just brand stability, but saving beer. I never want to see a beer go down the drain. It really hurts my soul when we have to dump something. So maintaining every batch is very important to me. Giving the brewer or the cellarman more control of your product over the course of a fermentation will lead to more consistent beer. And not just over the course of a single fermentation, but the next one, and the one following, and the one after that, and the one in 2 years. You can go back and look at all this data and gain knowledge from it. Less on-site sampling, right? No more having to come in on weekends, or, you can actually take a weekend, which is a big deal for a lot of folks. I know we discussed this with Andrew, being able to just leave for 2 full days is kind of stressful for some folks. So being able to just check in, open up your phone and say, yep, everything looks great. Don't need to worry about it. And it'll all be there when you get back. All that data will still be there. Having an alert system to let you know when something strays out of spec. So maybe you forgot to check your phone on vacation, and then you get a text or an email to let you know, hey, something's not quite right. You may want to look into this. You can get somebody on site to handle it without having to maintain somebody on site. And finally, no more guesswork. Establishing exactly when the beer is done, when you can get another batch started, and having that data in perpetuity. So that's what I have at the moment. I have a couple more minutes. I'm totally open to questions if we have anything going through.
Awesome. Rich, do you have a question? Rich?
Well, while Rich handles that, I should definitely say, if you have any questions that don't get answered here today, visit that website, precisionfermentation.com, or send an email to info@precisionfermentation.com. That'll get you in touch with our Director of Sales and Marketing. And then we can also, if it's necessary, pass you straight through to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. I actually had one question. Just curious. I know we talked about predictions. Can the data be applied to specific beers so that you can say, oh, you're like, I guess, can you target specific styles of beers that you make to kind of predict what you'll need to do with the yeast health, like because obviously everything's going to be a little different depending on what you're making.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Things like oxidative stress or osmotic pressure on your yeast, depending on your beer style. If you're making double IPAs, double dry hop, double IPAs all the time, that is going to put more stress on your yeast. And so ensuring that you keep track of yeast health over the course of several double dry hop, double IPAs, yeah, absolutely. That's going to have a massive impact. And like I said, maybe you can pull that yeast a little early and then ferment, you know, a blonde with it, and make sure that that yeast gets a little bit of a rest period to maintain.
Awesome. You have
Yeah, with the benchmarking and being able to you know, same beers or similar beers, benchmark those and seeing where they should be, and seeing if you've done a couple of batches and you start to see it wandering, then and everything else remains the same, then the most likely cause of that is your yeast and your yeast health. So that's when you can start really considering, do you use that again? Do you order a new pitch?
Thank you. So you have a couple questions on how this gets hooked up to the tank. Is it like, how does the sensor fit to the tank?
Sure.
Could you
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So we constructed what we call our tank connector. Pretty straightforward name. It is a stainless steel piece of equipment that connects directly to a 1.5 inch tri-clamp port. Typically, it will replace your Zwickle or your sample port, and has a sample port on its side. We are working to adapt to smaller tank fittings than that. We can typically get onto a 1 inch tri-clamp, and we are working on adapting it for even smaller ports than that. And then the sensor hub itself will connect to that tank connector. The tank connector is, like I said, all stainless steel, and it has 2 shutoff valves on it, so that the sensor hub can be moved from tank to tank. The important part for, I think, to impress on a lot of people is we want to capture fermentation specifically. Any conditioning you do in your fermenter, you could leave it on there for that, except for some cold crashing. But really, the important part is the fermentation. So, you know, if you had 2 tank connectors, you can have one on tank A, catch all the fermentation in that, and then a week later, you know, you brew into tank B, move the brew monitor over, and get all of the important fermentation data off of tank B as well, without ever having to dump the tank, or, you know, drain the tank rather.
Awesome. And so you might have answered the next questions with that, but we had any periodic calibration or maintenance, and can it be cleaned in place?
Sure, yeah. So periodic maintenance we do usually every 6 months. We'll bring it back, you know, make sure everything's clean and working order. We'll do calibration on it. The dissolved oxygen and pH gets calibrated in-house, and then we send it out. And on our console, we do have a pH compensation. So the probe does not need to be calibrated, but if you take a manual measurement, you can enter that into our console, and then the pH will compensate to adjust to the correct level. As far as cleaning, it doesn't get cleaned in place on tank. We have a cleaning cart with some cleaning buckets and cleaning solutions. So pull the sensor hub off tank. Between every fermentation, it must be cleaned. And then it gets cleaned in place sort of by itself, you know, on its own cart, not attached to the tank. Tank connectors, however, they're all, like I said, all stainless. They can be cleaned as part of the tank, however you handle the rest of your tank build and blow down.
Awesome.
The cleaning is essentially all, once you set it up, you set it running, and it lets you know when it's done and move to the next step, the cleaning, sanitation, that kind of thing. So it's you don't have to be sat there with it all the time. It will tell you when it's done.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. And then final question is the cost.
That is the thing. Not only can I not tell you, I don't actually know. That is nothing to do with me. Go ahead and hit up that email, info@precisionfermentation.com. They'll be able to handle that. At this point, I don't even have an estimate. I just work with them.
The cost benefit though is that, you know, every tank you save, all that data you collect that allows you to better manage each. I like to talk of it as there's return, the direct money goes in your bank, which is, you know, every additional tank turn and all that kind of thing. That's a value that is on your brewing staff, where because of being able to monitor the fermentations and to set alerts that they can you know that first 24 hours that things are going in the right direction and you don't have to worry about them. Likewise, if they're not going in the right direction, you can find out that a lot earlier and intervene, and maybe save a batch or at least turn things around quicker. You know, if your yeast isn't behaving, you can know maybe a week that order another pitch if you plan to reuse, and so you can have that yeast available rather than, you know, the day off finding out that that yeast you can't use and you're scrambling around trying to find an alternative pitch. So there's there's money you can generate by having this system, and there's also just your brewer's peace of mind, which, you know, can be very, very valuable.
Sure. Should not be overlooked. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We are out of time. I appreciate you, Dave, Andrew, for hopping on and presenting us with this useful information. It's been great. Thank you for our Wednesday presenting sponsor, Magline. And also thank you to our session sponsors, Ironheart Canning, Precision Fermentation, and Drink Tanks. We hope to see you guys next at the 1 o'clock farm brewing session. So everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.